There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 25th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. We have a lot to go over today, so I'm not going to have a big preamble on my side. I'm going to repeat the same thing I repeat every single time, though. We are enormously interested in getting as much feedback from this group as we possibly can. So if you have questions or comments, please do not feel shy about sharing those with us. Type your messages in the chat if you don't have access to a microphone or you're at work and supposed to be doing something else. If you do have a microphone, feel free to interrupt us. We do it all the time. It's allowed here. What else do I usually talk about? I think that might be it. Oh, I do. I was forgetting something. I want to ensure that we continue these conversations in our subreddit. There's a lot to go over. We are unable to get through all of it in these calls, and it's important to me that we consider these things the beginning of a conversation and not the conversation itself. So we have chats here, we look at data, we talk about issues, we discuss directions for the future, and then we move those discussions into Reddit, because these calls are enormously time bound. They're North America friendly, they're in English, and they last for an hour, and that's a very, very small window for people to schedule their lives around. So it's important that we use these as a way to kick off new initiatives, new ideas, and then spend the next week or so discussing them and pulling them apart in the MakerGov subreddit. I am going to post a link to that discussion in a second. But first, I'm going to hand it off to Stephen Becker to give us his thoughts for the week. Then I'm going to pick it up again to have a brief chat about the poll we just had, and then trying to keep my speechifying down enough so we can move almost immediately into risk, because the quality of the analysis that we're getting in the last few calls is amazing, and I don't want to monopolize the time. So having said all that, Stephen, off to you.
Thank you. Just want to confirm, can you hear me clearly?
Yep, that sounds a bit echoey, but we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm in one of these weird telephone coffin things that it's kind of difficult to get used to. But anyway, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is, I see that the turnout is quite spectacular. The one thing I want to do is sort of jump on quickly is obviously, we've had some changes in the organization as reflected by our blog post and further reflected by other articles that have come out. And the one thing I just really want to say about it is, if you want to see what's going on, go and refer to our blog post, have a look, and you get a sense of where we are. We are, effectively going through changes like everyone else. And, some of the... Oh my goodness. They're going to have a fire drill in my... That's unbelievable. That's funny. Anyway, so what I want to get at is that we're going through some of these changes, and you want to have a look at what they are. Please refer to our blog post that we put out. I think it was about a week and a half ago. But importantly, and more relevant to today's conversation, I would like to focus on, the idea of we are all here to facilitate and try to understand scientific governance. And to that end, we need to have a very clear idea as to what that really is. And to emphasize it, well, it effectively is MakerDAO as a community trying to govern through the use of scientific principles. Now, I understand that I just rephrased the same statement, but it allows one to focus on the fact that what we require is rigor around qualitative and quantitative models and methods that give us the ability to put forward proposals and to assess those proposals appropriately. Now, the reason why we want to do this through quantitative and qualitative methods and models is that we can contain the level of discussion. We can contain the level of contention so that we don't have subjectivity running amok. We make sure that the conversation is applicable to the running of the system. We make sure that the ideas are productive and actually move the system forward in terms of what it wants to achieve in terms of its objectives. So, to that end, the idea is to ensure that contention and, the ability to create factions through subjectivity is contained within rigor and the ability to reproduce results. Because if you have that ability, then you're always going to have a productive discussion. Folks may not always agree on the particular discussion, but at least it will be productive. The main underpinning of a scientific approach is to ensure that we always consider proposals that are productive and useful for the MakerDAO protocol. So that if someone comes along and decides that they want to turn MakerDAO into an ice cream factory, it's going to become very clear that that is not something purposeful and that is not something we can sort of rigorously defend. So therefore, it is not a productive proposal. And as such, folks will be very clear on the fact that that is something that we should not entertain. So in essence, what we're doing is we're moving away from representative democracy and looking at subjective points of view and focusing wholeheartedly on scientific premise of rigor and reproducibility to be able to extract value from proposals that are being put forward. So that is just my quick preamble into what is scientific governance and making sure that we focus our attention on those tenets that help us create the necessary value. But at the same time, please keep in mind that this 1 hour window that we have is just simply the momentum behind a broader governance process. It's a governance process that is decentralized and requires everyone to continually be a part of in order to get a sense of not only what is happening, but also be able to evaluate proposals being put forward. And in their minds, vote on things that will extract the appropriate value and the appropriate robustness for the system as a whole. So after that bit of a data dump, I feel like the fire marshal's about to kick me out of this office, but I'll hand it over to Rich.
All right, thank you, Stephen. That was a good recap, and I think that it overlaps with some of the things that I wanted to talk about very briefly today. One of them is a tricky subject, and it's strangely after this your reminder that everything needs to be rigorous and well thought out and as scientific as humanly possible. I want to talk a bit about sentiment, and sentiment is an issue that we've been running into for the last few weeks, maybe perhaps longer, but it's sort of coming to a head recently. And sentiment is a tricky thing, particularly in the crypto space. Generally, there's enough criticism and resentment and frustration that can be evenly distributed across everyone in the space, seemingly without being specifically targeted. There's a lot of angry people in the world, and crypto is a great place for them to live. And MakerDAO, I think, has been particularly lucky in that respect, in that we've been sort of media and crypto darlings for the longest time. And it was a good feeling while it lasted, but it was clear to a lot of us that that wasn't a position that was written in stone, and it's always subject to change. And one of the things that we've seen recently is sort of this uptick in frustration levels around the PEG, frustration levels around the stability fee changes. And those things, they tend to get condensed and distilled in social media for all the attendant risks involved with social media. I don't need to get into that, but in Reddit and Twitter, there's a market basically for contrarian opinions and hot takes and being first to market with outrage and shock. And it's very easy for that extremely vocal minority to create a sense of panic or artificial urgency. And it's something that we need to take into account when we are coming up with plans in these calls, and when we're coming up with plans in the subreddits, and when we are having discussions, is that this is a very dramatic business that we're in. It's a very open business. There's blog posts and crypto journalism journalists everywhere you go. A few of our favorite are actually in this call. Hello, Christine. And it's easy for people to sort of overemphasize things, or perhaps cast a vote for solutions. And that's one of the things. So I'm kind of teeing something up here. So what that does is it can be a little contrary, or put some pressure on this idea of measured scientific governance, where we make plans and decisions, and we, as a group, all discuss ideas and then come up with these models and excuse me, these plans for the future, and these, for example, the stability fee raises. How those things get into the system is a large and fairly onerous process. And the reason why it's an onerous process is because it's designed to be that way. Pulling levers and pressing buttons because you're upset and or frustrated and or nervous is a very risky thing to do in any business, but particularly in one where people's value is at stake. And that's why there's so many checks and balances built into the MakerDAO system. I'm not really heading towards a very specific point to be made here, but one of those points is that excuse me, that we've seen this in the subreddit where, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? This gets upvoted a lot, and a lot of statements or questions about, I think we should do this, and why haven't you done that kind of stuff. And what I wanted to reinforce in today's call is that the likelihood of that implementing any sort of change is very, very, very small. The way that things get altered in this system is, as to Stephen's point, through the scientific governance framework. And it's a series of 4 documents, and I can post links to them when I'm finished speechifying in the sidebar. But they very kind of clearly outline how changes happen in the system, how they need to be evaluated, what kind of considerations need to be taken into account, what kind of thinking needs to go behind them. And we're all moving towards this model as quickly as we possibly can, where those changes need to be backed up by clean data sets that have been approved, by reproducible algorithms that anybody can download from GitHub and run themselves to validate the assumptions in these proposals. We're not there yet. We're getting there very, very quickly. But in the meantime, we need to do as much due diligence as we possibly can. So if somebody wants to see a change in the system, it needs to be a lot more than an opinion. It needs to be, I want to do X because of Y. These are the implications that we've thought about. Here's the risks that have been identified. Here's the impacts that here's how it could impact these 3 or 4 stakeholders in the system. Here's how it can be undone. Here's what the polling process looks like. I'm not a risk expert, and I'm not a data analyst, so I can only provide some of these broad strokes. The risk teams can probably provide a list of 50 different questions that need to be addressed. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a significant amount of due diligence that needs to be performed before changes to the system can be considered. And that, I think, is where I'm probably going to leave things right now. Chris, I can see you unmuting yourself. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I just kind of wanted to push back on some of the things you said, specifically around how there needs to be kind of all this redundancy and robust data before MKR holders decide to vote on a specific proposal. I mean, I understand the overarching goal of having better data, but we're kind of we're in uncharted territory right here, and there have been changes made to the system, specifically around stability fees, and there have been some assumptions that have been made that turned out to not be true. For example, stability fees not having the effect that we'd like them to have, and I just think that it's MKR token holders who truly govern the system. If they want to be capricious and just put votes and changes into the system, they probably can. So,
well, sure, yeah, I see your point completely, and I was hoping that maybe I didn't make myself clear enough that we're in this situation where we don't have the robust models, we don't have the clean data, we don't have the approved sets and the repeatable systems that the rest of the financial world have been using for the last X number 100 of years. We're moving towards that as quickly as we can. In the interim, though, the solution to this problem in the absence of a very clear process is that we need to find this middle ground between opinion and a very well-reasoned opinion, and eventually moving towards a model, a script, code that can prove that the assumptions are, or at least back up people's assumptions. The point that I want to make today, though, is that we need to be in that middle ground where there's a very well-reasoned, very comprehensive argument with at least loose data, somebody's data to back up some of these assumptions. And I think that from that point, that gives the foundation something to grab onto, that to move something forward into a proposal phase. And we can't move into a proposal phase based on 1 or 2 sentence comments in the subreddit. There needs to be a middle ground where there's a reasoned argument as opposed to an opinion. I don't know precisely what that looks like. I am hoping that we can discover that in the subreddit or in these calls, what a proposal would look like, what kind of things people want to have proposals about. And maybe that's a good place to leave it, because my hope was that we could start a conversation today briefly about the nature of proposals, but having that framed by the fact that it needs to be very well considered. And ultimately, the role of the foundation right now is to shepherd the organization through a process of eventual decentralization, right? That's built into the principles. And we've tossed around fake numbers. You can't predict how long that's going to take, but it needs to be understood that this is like a years-long process before all the checks and balances come off. So anyways, I promised I wasn't going to speechify, and it's already 20 after the hour. So if there's any comments or questions or suggestions about how we could facilitate and or optimize and or frame the way the proposal process works, add those to the discussion thread that I posted in the side, and we can continue those discussions over the course of the week, or type in your questions now. Otherwise, I think I'm going to hand it off to the risk team because Vishesh and Primosh, I think, have something up their sleeves for us today.
Yeah, let me just do a quick outline. So I think we're going to have.
You know, Cyrus, this is embarrassing. I have to cut you off because I realized I forgot the second half of what I wanted to talk about. I want to go over the poll really fast. That's the whole point of why we're here, kind of. So we saw something. I don't think it's necessary to pull up graphs and analysis about what happened with the poll. I think there's something interesting that we can consider here, though. We had an option of leave the stability fee where it is, so a raise of 0% all the way up to 4%. We saw far more of a distribution of votes, uneven distribution, which is good. That shows that there's some kind of signaling at work here. The surprising thing that happened this week, though, was 12,000 Maker was staked at the 4% stability fee level, but 50,000 was staked at the 2% stability fee level. And so there's things that we need to think about here, because that says, depending on how you want to interpret that data, it could mean a few different things. And I'll probably leave it up to the community to speculate on what that means. But the fact that a poll landed on the mid point of the available options is an interesting thing to consider. So I wanted to throw that out there. And sorry, Cyrus, for wrecking your flow, but you can pick it up again now if you want.
Oh, that's okay. So we'll look at some data from Vishesh and Primosh, and then I think we should spend some time talking about the stability fee in particular as the primary policy tool. I think there's been a lot of contention or confusion about how that works. I think we should kind of just try to have like a genuine conversation and kind of air people's concerns, Chris's or whomever else, and then maybe after that we can discuss alternate policy tools if people want to. But I think that would be a good flow to go with. So I'm just gonna pass it over to Vishesh first.
Thanks, Cyrus. Let me share my screen here. Okay. So I think based on some feedback from last week, and we'll continue to, I think, iterate on making sure we're showing things succinctly and focusing on the things that people are really interested in discussing. But to start off, just what's been going on with the price. So added some ticks here for the stability fee changes. What was interesting was with the last increase, the price has held relatively steady, but still below the peg. And I think this is going to kind of be the theme of the past week is we've seen an impact from the stability fee, but it is not necessarily to bring up in any like sustained meaningful way the price above like a 97-ish level or 0.97 level. What we have seen though is the impact on supply. So what's really interesting now is I feel, and again, this was part of the theme of the discussion last week, is how much can we really start to draw patterns and conclusions versus we're just getting a few data points and we need more time and more sample size to really start to draw conclusions. But what I think we're seeing here is that the stability fee clearly has an impact on supply. It may not be enough to purely increase the stability fee to really get the peg back up to $1. And I think that's a conversation that we should be having. The other thing that I do want to say is volume has been very low. So we can sort of take these numbers with a grain of salt right now because that trading volume has been low since a large quantity of trades and wipes 2-3 weeks ago.
Hey, Vishesh, just one really, really good question. I don't want to break your flow here, but it just seems to me that every time we pull these up, and immediately after a stability fee change, volume almost has universally always dropped off immediately following that. I mean, at least going back to the past presentations that you've done. Is that a trend that you've seen as well?
Well, so what I would say is, let's talk about supply, because I think the volume is to some extent a function of supply. If there's less DAI out there because it's being wiped down, I'm not surprised that there are some slight dips in trading volume. And I would imagine that some of the trading volume around DAI before the increases is people trying to get their hands back on some DAI so that they can wipe down some of that debt so they're not exposed to higher rates in the future. So it's relative because I'm sure there's a bit of a run up. At least there was when we started talking about, there was a big prolonged discussion around this 11.5% increase. And so I think prior to that, there was people getting their hands on DAI. And then since then, I think you do tend to see a drop in trading volume because there is a drop in supply.
So isn't part of it also because the executive vote runs on Fridays and leading into the weekend, we're going to see lower volume? I also bet that the DAI volume correlates heavily with the broader crypto markets, like what Bitcoin and Ethereum are doing on those particular days.
I definitely don't doubt that last point because, and we'll talk about this in a second, ETH price is, again, just to me, the tried and true driver of what's going on with DAI price, and I wouldn't be surprised if it has an impact on trading volume as well. So just to kind of show that here, we're seeing this kind of sustained correlation between what's going on with ETH price and what happens with DAI price. It's definitely, I understand, not like a one-to-one. It's not something that we can ignore either, because we saw just earlier in April like this run up in ETH price, and that was sort of part of when DAI was really suffering. And then ETH price came down a little bit around the time that we jacked up some stability fees. So if we go back to here, this was the 14.5% increase. And so you kind of had this moment of, we were discussing, repetitive fee increases at the same time that DAI price was starting to fall. And I think that led to kind of a swerve back onto the road a little bit when we were, veering towards 96, 95, 94 a little bit. And so that was, I think, an effective monetary policy change. What is interesting, though, is now that ETH price is kind of a little bit more volatile, but still holding at relative levels, I think there's a lot of wait and see mentality in terms of what people want to do with derivative positions, whether they want to lever up further, whether they want to start to ease off the gas a little bit. And so I think there's a depression in volume, partly because of a bit of a wait and see mentality. People aren't sure at these levels, like what's going to happen with ETH price. Whereas earlier, I think people were way more bullish on ETH price, and so they were levering up way more on DAI. And so that kind of segues into the DAI supply. what we've seen, I think, and again, I do want to encourage, I think that we have seen an actual impact from these stability fee increases that is like clear and measurable. And so that's primarily the outstanding supply. So we've seen, you know, as we increased to 7.5%, there was a lot going on with ETH price. There was a lot of unpredictability in what was happening with DAI supply. But as we started discussing the 11.5% increase and then implementing it and then discussing a further increase, and it was becoming clear to, I think, the market, the community, that this was going to be a series of increases, that we started to see the DAI supply really start to come down. And so there's been a ton of burns. I mean, I tweeted about this a little bit about a few specific transactions, and we discussed this on last week's call, but that's really not reversed. So I think that's a positive indicator. I mean, it's still, we need more time to really be sure, but it seems that that trend is not reversing, and it seems that the increased cost of drawing out this DAI has really been an actual effective deterrent in terms of contracting the supply, although contracting that supply has not purely saved the price peg. And so that's probably a separate discussion that this group of the community should have, is in addition to what's going on with supply, what else can we be doing about the price? Or is there kind of a equilibrium level of the price, like, you know, at a 98-ish level? And I know there was a few folks throwing that idea around on the calls.
Vishesh, there was a question in chat from Samuel Barl asking, what other alternatives and options do you think could get us back to the spot price of the peg?
David, let's save that for after, when we...
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I do think that's a big question that warrants a broader discussion. And then just the last little piece, I don't want to take up too much time. What's been going on kind of the secondary platforms? So Compound, the interest rates, we discussed on the last call that you know, it was finally more expensive to get DAI from Maker. What's interesting is this has not reversed either. I mean, we see a little bit of kind of a potential recovery, but either that will take more time or it won't happen, which is kind of interesting. The borrow rate for DAI on Compound has not jumped back up to, you know, the 14.5% level. And then the supply rate, I think, has just moved sort of in lockstep with the borrow rate. But when you look at the volume, so I think, again, on this theme of like, can we start to draw conclusions? What we do see is when we jack up the stability fee, there is a clear drop in the supply that's being lent on these platforms. The borrow does not appear to me, and I can, you know, run some numbers to confirm, to be highly correlated with the increases. There are these kind of semi-independent, and it's good. I think we should look for independent signals from stability fee increases. But I think, again, this may have to do with more with ETH price and less with what's going on with the stability fee. These jumps in the borrow volume on Compound. Now, I think we saw a little bit of a dip and then a recovery, so it's really hard to say what's going on since the 14.5% increase. But the borrow volume, I think, has not changed significantly. So what's interesting is initially when we were jacking up to 11.5%, we saw you know, a few big holders trying to get their hands quickly on some DAI to pay down their debts. I don't think those big holders have now, at least the ones that, you know, were deterred by anything less than, I don't know, 25% rate. Those kind of reasonable range holders, I don't think have gone and levered back up in terms of drawing out debt. So they don't have, you know, those large outstanding debts to go and borrow DAI on secondary platforms to go and pay down. So what we've seen, I think, as a result is not a huge change in the loan supply and borrow and lending volumes. One thing that I did want to just quickly mention, because it was part of the discussion last week, I had a graph, but a couple of technical errors. So that'll be up next week. The collateralization ratio. So, and apologies that they're not on the same screen here, but you see April 14th and April 19th are these two most recent increases. The collateralization ratio on Maker has not significantly increased. It ran up a little bit with what was going on with ETH price, but people have actually, I think, reduced the collateralization ratio slightly. Again, ETH price has come down slightly, but if I run the numbers on this, I believe the drop in collateralization ratio is more than just what's been going on with ETH price. So people have kind of let their foot off the gas a little bit, I think, in terms of the amount of collateral they need to collateralize their loans with. So that's, to me, a little bit more of a risk tolerance, a little bit less fear of getting liquidated and all that again. So I will stop here. If there is anything that someone wanted to double click on, ask questions, etc., I'm happy to. Otherwise, I'll hand it back to Cyrus.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Vishesh. That was great. Let's quickly jump into the next presentation, and then we'll do big discussion afterwards. So, Primoz, are you ready to?
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I actually don't have much to show you for the past week because I just updated my old spreadsheet and wasn't really focusing on new metrics. What stands out in the past week is higher activity of ETH being removed or freed from the collateral in the middle of the week. There's the yellow bar here. And then yesterday and some other CDPs were locking some larger amount of Ether in the collateral. There wasn't really much activity in vibes and draws. They're more, I mean, especially in comparison with last week, they were more or less balanced, except on the day of the interest rate hike, when almost 1 million of DAI was wiped, and therefore DAI in circulation in the whole week fell by only about 1 million or 1.5 million. So the pattern is still the same. Single activity events still amount to about 1/3 of total activity. The top 5 events similarly to about 3/4 or 75 of the whole activity. Although we could see that locks and draws in the past week were a bit more popular among smaller CDPs and newer ones. I guess these guys are a bit more bullish. And freeze and wipes were associated with larger CDPs who were mostly deleveraging. That's why I could see a bit of a decrease in collateralization ratios. There was about 200 CDPs interacting with the system last week. And as I mentioned, the largest part of activity is associated with ETH being freed or removed from collateral. Interestingly, we didn't see high correlation between free and wipe activity, and we don't know exactly what caused CDP owners to unlock Ether and not really use it for debt repayment afterwards. Potentially, they might be moving Ether from collateral into some other assets. They could be transferring it to BTC, which actually outperformed Ether in past week. I don't know. But the other theory is also that these CDP owners might be transferring Ether to other platforms, such as Dharma Compound, and might be actually building leverage there because interest rates are much more favorable with in comparison with Maker. And we actually saw increase in amount of DAI being borrowed on Dharma, I think. And the other theory is that CDPs wanted to lower their leverage and converted Ether to fiat, but then I guess they would be more willing to buy DAI and lower debt exposure, especially since DAI trades below 1, but we haven't seen that really because vibes were actually lagging freeze in value. So that's basically more or less all from me in relation to CDP statistics for this week. Nothing special, to be honest.
Okay, cool. So then before we jump into the stability fee, I just want to kick it off with a quick reminder or refresher. So the goal of the stability fee changes is to reduce the DAI supply, which in turn should theoretically push the DAI price up. So I want to distinguish that as we talk about this. Do people think that increased stability fees won't be reducing the DAI supply as effectively as we might have considered, or that a supply reduction itself is just not going to have the effect that we think it's going to. So I see these two concepts get muddied up quite a bit. So for example, I mean, we have seen some small DAI supply reduction from about, I think the high was around 95, 96 million down to currently 88 million. And we saw that twice actually. After it dipped down, it went back up and then came down again. So it's clear that, you know, the supply is trending downwards, but do people think that if we continue raising the stability fee and having the DAI supply kind of keep going down, that it won't push the DAI price up? Just something to keep in mind.
So Cyrus, if I could add a thought that I was having about this exact thing. I think that on the spot markets, as there's like more DAI demand, presumably from people wiping, which also just isn't unclear that that's happening, but like I imagine that the market makers will probably be unloading between 98.5 and $1, so that there's like additional basically liquidity on the sell side right below $1. So it might take a lot to actually get to the peg because market makers are eager to offload. What do you think about that?
Right. So I mean, I don't see anything structurally wrong with that approach. I think there's this fear that the stability fee might have to go too high, which is a nebulous concept. And I actually wanted to share a picture. Or Pramosh, do you have a link to that tweet or that picture of the Bitfinex margin rates?
Yeah, I have it, but I think it's better if I screen share it.
Oh, I just posted it. All right. So Rich posted a link in the chat where, you know, basically, I think these are the margin rates for Bitfinex, and you know, we can see that there's just massive variance in this rate that, you know, fluctuates heavily based on kind of the spot demand for leverage on the exchange. And you know, there's obviously some nuances, some subtleties that are different between this rate and the maker stability fee, but I think overall the shape, you know, it's reasonable to assume that they will look somewhat similar. So back to your question, David, I think that if we can collectively agree that a higher stability fee lowers the supply and we're comfortable with basically highly variable, you know, high variance stability fees, and I don't see anything structurally deficient with the current lever that we're using. But I know others.
You explained this to me a couple of days ago, and it was sort of an aha moment for me. And I think it might be useful to dig into this a bit more, because it ties back to this theme that we've been having in these calls of needing to have a better understanding of what people use the CDP engine for. And there's been this question about, is it just to unlock liquidity to do X, Y, or Z, or is it primarily a leverage tool? And I think that by comparing the response of the community to, or CDP owners to, the stability fee hikes, and especially with comparing it back to Primosh's Twitter thread that I posted, which is worth a read, is your impression that the reaction to the market to these stability fee increases is a pretty clear indication that leverage is the primary use case here? Like
yeah, I think right? Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're still investigating that, but I think it's fairly clear that you know, the primary use case for CDPs is leverage. I mean, we can just tell that from the correlation of DAI price to the ETH price, and
that creates a very clear, a lot clearer picture about whether the stability fee is the correct lever then in that regard, because the risk appetite, if obviously the clear primary usage is leverage, the risk appetite is going to be a lot higher, and the premium people are willing to pay for that liquidity.
Right. That, yeah. So I mean, essentially, if all of a sudden there's a huge surge of demand for leverage, then, you know, it makes sense that the system would have to kind of price itself accordingly in order to maintain the stability that we desire. If it doesn't, then obviously that leverage is being offered at too cheap a rate, and we end up in the situation that we're in. So I mean, I think that part is kind of is fairly clear. I think what's unclear, or what caught most of us off guard, is just how variable that rate, just how volatile that rate can be. Can a sudden surge of demand for leverage, such as in an impending bull market like we've been in, is it really feasible that would push the rates as aggressively as it did? And I think the answer is sort of in the middle. So I think maybe the stability fee was too low to begin with. So if it had started off at something like somewhere in the 5 to 10% range, then the current fee that we're seeing wouldn't be have such a shock factor to it. So I think that's played a part for the emotional side of things as well. But I think the reality is that for as long as DAI is being used primarily for leverage, we can and should expect highly volatile stability fees going forward. Mm-hmm. On the reverse too, if it overshoots, or if for whatever reason the bull market just suddenly dies, I think we could see a quick correction in terms of demand for leverage.
So I have two quick questions for you, Cyrus. So I mean, obviously, like everything you said kind of brings the question to MKR governance of should we be considering even higher fee increases than 4 and 10% right, to the 20 and 30% levels? And then also, let me just add, there's also the question of what are the risks of overshooting, and are they like immediate risk, urgent risks, or is overshooting kind of a meme that's taken too urgently?
I mean, I don't think we know the answer to the risk of overshooting. I know there's some in this call that are somewhat concerned with it. Personally, I'm not. I just do think once we overshoot, it's gonna require some swift governance to quickly undo it. I mean, I think we'll have a bit of a buffer, as if there's room in the debt ceiling, then market makers can generate DAI and push the price back down. But that's just kind of like, let's cross that bridge when we get there. Let's fix the immediate problem. I don't want to dominate this conversation, so please, others, jump in.
Yeah, I would love to hear from the community, actually. So we have a lot of bigwigs in the call, a lot of maker holders and a lot of maker voters. So some opinions about what their impression is about this mid-range selection in their most recent poll, whether that implies sentiment has maybe scared people away from trying to increase it any farther, whether the community or the maker voters have believed that they're achieving or getting close to an equilibrium. I'd like some additional insight because I don't know what's happening, and I'd like to understand the poll that we just had. Should I call people out specifically? Put them on the spot? One confirmation, you guys have an opinion? Matthew, you're always good for an opinion.
So there's a few things maybe to touch on there, Cyrus, and I think you made some really good points. One, I like the way that you framed it, in that we have two hypotheses here, just going back all the way to the first thing that you mentioned. On the one side, we have the question of, does the stability fee affect supply, and if so, to what extent? And there's a question is to what extent does the change in supply then have an impact on price? And I agree that we have to think about one and the other. We haven't seen the stability fee have an enormous effect on supply, and so therefore, when we don't have that data, it's hard to answer question number two. And so until we see that, I think all that is going to be questioned, not just by people on this call, but the broader community that potentially spends a little bit less time on this. That's just something to be aware of that we can't do much about. I mean, if we're disciplined about continuing to increase the stability fee until we see the results that we would like to see or are refuted in our initial hypothesis, that just will remain open. And that's something we need to be comfortable with. On the question of overshooting, just because I have a strong opinion about this, I am absolutely not worried about overshooting. In fact, I don't think it would be a bad thing if we overshot a little bit. and that means the market makers would be able to clear some trades at above $1, and they've valiantly defended the peg for us to the extent that they have with significant capital. And so I wouldn't mind if that happened to reward them for that, taking that risk for us. So that's just 2 cents on 2 things that you mentioned in there.
Right, and part of what I said kind of bridges into this, the idea of alternate solutions, such as obviously reducing the debt ceiling. So if people are of the opinion that a reduced supply won't have an effect, then the debt ceiling argument is moot anyways, because it's accomplishing the exact same thing. If you do think that reduced supply will help, then is it not worth just considering a continuation of the supply reduction through the stability fee? So like I said, we've seen some reduction from 96 to 88. What is that, like maybe 8% reduction, which is not great. But so is that not enough confirmation for certain people that higher fee has resulted in a lower supply? And I mean, no secret, I'm not for the debt ceiling reduction, but happy to hear other thoughts. But for me, I think it kind of creates some weird incentives that we haven't fully thought out yet. So it turns the system from a permissionless one into a first come first serve. CDP owners might fear that they wouldn't be able to open one back up if they were to close it. So
why would they think that though?
Why would they think which one?
Why would they think that for some reason that the debt ceiling would prevent them from opening up a CDP in the future?
No, I mean, well, if they were to close one right now, then they would have to wait for so let's say the debt ceiling was set to 50 million and they closed it right now, then they wouldn't be able to reopen one until it fell below 50 million, right?
Isn't it much more likely that they would try to figure out ways to sell their CDP? The CDP market opens up. I agree with you that there are kind of some unintended consequences of just immediately slashing the debt ceiling to a level where like folks can't issue new DAI. But I think that the technical risk of global settlement certainly is a lot more palatable if there's, say, $75 million in DAI outstanding as opposed to 90 million, or $70 million in DAI outstanding as opposed to 87. Because that's probably the biggest risk that DAI holders and just the larger community have, is that the peg remains unstable for a significant period of time, and then there's a panic in DAI markets. And instead of focusing on the size of the auditorium, really what we should be focusing on is the size of the exit door. And in a post-global settlement world, things may get a little hairy. I mean, maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think there is a reasonable argument for lowering the debt ceiling to something above where we're currently at, to let's say 90 million. That's actually not something that I'm for or against one way or another, but that doesn't also have an immediate effect on the DAI price. But I see what you're saying. In terms of the global settlement risk, I mean, for me, that's an entirely separate conversation, because when Maker scales to billions or more, I mean, we're going to have to deal with that in much different.
100%, but like we'll come to that bridge when we cross it. Right now, we all acknowledge that we're in beta. We're in single collateral DAI. We can only use Ether. The peg has been broken for 3 months. We're increasing stability fees at a rapid pace, right? I think a lot of people are kind of surprised that the most recent stability fee increase just went through on Friday as quickly as it did, but it did. And right now, I think it's not an irrelevant conversation to start having, that like, at what point does like a super high stability fee just become kind of that we should think about raising it for public policy reasons, right? Like, I don't think we're there yet, but I'm just saying that is a looming consideration once we start getting above 20%. And it's really, I just don't understand what the downside is of acknowledging that we're in beta, trying to use all the tools in the tool belt to try to fix the outstanding price of supply. Market makers will not create CDPs to issue themselves more DAI, and unless at the same time they're naturally long ETH. So that's a red herring. I still think that there's a lot of inventory. There was some excellent data on CDPs prevented from Primo. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right. Primos. And if you look, the CDP whales, they're still issuing themselves more DAI. They're not wiping. I mean, I see the reduction in supply,
but that's exactly the point.
It's moving. It's moving
about that
very
for a second, Chris. That's exactly the point. Every CDP owner is selfish. They're looking after their own best interests. And if their own best interests at these current prices...
Yes.
Chris, let Matthew just speak for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when you're acting up in your own best interest, if you're still willing to mint DAI at these prices in a permissionless system, that means you're doing it for a reason that's beneficial to yourself. On a blended basis, somebody's found an angle on how to borrow money and make money by borrowing at these rates. It's screwing with the rest of the entire community because nobody else has an appetite. Well, some people apparently do.
Sure.
But the challenge is that until there's a demand offset, the blended basis, people are still finding ways to make it work up until the point where they don't. And the question is, when do we find that blended stability fee? We start introducing artificial tools.
I don't know. Okay, hold on one second though, because this keeps coming up, and I don't know why all of a sudden, right? Like we're just stability fee purists when it comes to measuring the kind of the viability of using a stability fee to quote lower supply and fix the peg, right? Like that's not.
So I can answer that. I think I can answer that.
Okay, but again, what's artificial about this? Because this whole thing is pretty artificial. Like the whole thing is not. It's a misnomer. It's a mischaracterization. It's trying to paint something as being kind of like ugly and like against market forces, but I just don't understand. So yeah, but by all means.
Sure. So let me try to answer it. So I think people have. People think that people misunderstand what the primary risk to the debt ceiling is, and it's actually not. It's not relevant to monetary policy or the DAI stability, but rather is a function of the risk of the collateral failing. So how much, if debt ceiling for a risky asset is $1 billion and it fails, and that's $1 billion of bad debt. Technically not something that's related to monetary policy.
I get that. But I guess why? And I understand too that that this may be a growing minority, but a minority position nonetheless, right? Is we think we're pretty certain that we have too much supply, right? I think everyone is in agreement with that. And I don't have a good reason why, if we have too much supply, why don't we cap supply, understanding full well that we're in data, we're into the collateral DAI.
Chris, you're nailing the theoretical on the front end. No, I'm not even disputing the theoretical on the front end.
I feel like we're agreeing.
Okay. Yeah, the challenge is not what you do to start, it's what you do to stop. Okay, think about what you're saying. If you're putting a tool in there that limits supply in its creation, how do you turn it off? And do you not expect when you release that inhibition, you're going to have the exact opposite challenge? Because you're not finding a market solution, a market force solution. You're introducing another force. That's the point.
Totally. So, but here's the thing, right? Is that we have this great data set about what happened the last time we ran up against the debt ceiling. DAI appreciated above $1, and then once the debt ceiling was raised, the pressure was relieved, and DAI traded much closer to $1 than it is right now. In December, we had a very large CDP. It's the largest CDP that we have. Just opened, $13 million in DAI issued, and I'm only bringing this up because we're kind of in a situation right now where we could keep raising the stability fee, which I think is a good idea, but I think it's important to keep having conversations like this because, like,
Chris, sorry, I need to cut you off. Look,
oh, sure.
Actually, I'm not going to kill the conversation. Let's stick around after the call, but we're at the top of the hour and we're going to start losing a pile of people. So, Stephen, if you want to give us your final thought, anybody who's interested in continuing the debt ceiling conversation, stick around, but I'll let you go, Stephen.
No worries. I just want to basically just thank everyone for being on this call and just listening to the points that have been raised. It's very interesting to think about, the stability fee as a lever and think more broadly about, what is the environment, what does the ecosystem look like to make a stability fee more effective than, what we believe it is doing at the moment. At the same time, probably be cognizant of the fact that what that ideal state is and trying to compare it to where we are. And think clearly about what are the demand factors that we need to innovate on to try and counter, as opposed to just try to counter and build the system, as opposed to try and manage something that we are at the same time bootstrapping. But to all the folks that have contributed in this conversation, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it, and I think that we can, definitely keep the momentum behind this.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everybody, for your great and impassioned conversations and thoughts today. Last week, we kept the call going after the 10 o'clock mark, and it was well received, surprisingly. So I think we can potentially do that again. So if people don't have jobs to do, feel free to hang out, and we can continue to talk ourselves out. One thing I do want to caution, Chris, love your passion. It's very important that we let people finish their conversations. I don't want to turn this thing to turn into a Fox and Friends kind of deal. So let's make sure that we do the back and forth thing and let people have their say.
I think we are doing a pretty good job back and forth.
That's not bad. It could be better. So anyways, that's just for everybody in the room, actually, because I think Joe's about to blow us up.
Yeah, I mean, we got to allow people to go back and forth, Chris. I know you go on your roles, and you do a good job when you go on your roles. I understand, but we got to go back and forth on this conversation. I think it's important on the debt ceiling.
Totally,
and
totally.
This is an important thing. When you die above $1, there are a lot of people on this call that didn't get a chance to talk during the hour. I think maybe that's next time we suggest the Q&A. We have a shorter speaking part and a bigger Q&A. Because I know there are a lot of partners that would love to talk because they want to drive DAI back up to $1.
That's a great point, and thanks, Joe. That's something that we've been talking about for a while, is whether this call should actually break out into something different at 10 o'clock, where we basically, maybe just a round table around risk, whether it's just random questions, maybe it's just thoughts and feelings and all the rest of it. So maybe let's do that. I'm not sure whether we're talked out on the debt ceiling thing yet, judging from Chris's passion. I think probably not, but there are a lot of other questions that got asked. David, if you can scroll through the chat and see if there's anything that was hyper relevant, or if anybody asked a question in the chat that didn't get addressed, please re-ask or jump in.
Well, I think that we should continue with the debt ceiling discussion, but Mike did post a link to his some of his thoughts that are actually, he pointed out, contrary to the position of Wire as one of the largest DAI market makers. So it's definitely something that the community should take a look at. But other than that, I didn't see anything particular. Yeah.
All right, we'll keep an eye on it. Let me finish up. Let me maybe try and put a bow on this debt ceiling thing. So it's potentially not something I don't know. I'm not going to stifle the conversation. If people want to keep on talking about it, that's great. Here's my advice, though. We have this. Maybe I'll try and reframe things. So we had this discussion where I think, at least personally, it's becoming obvious that, and maybe I'm just the slowest guy in the room, that CDPs are all about leverage. People are willing to lever up because they're potentially degenerate gamblers, or who knows how things work. So a high stability fee is not really a disincentive. So perhaps we haven't found out what that sweet spot is yet. There's another school of thought that just simply artificially capping the amount of DAI that's in circulation is a valid way to go as well. I'm not smart enough.
We've already artificially capped total supply.
Sure. This is the thing where I want to finish my sentence before you jump in, Chris. So the next step is we need to completely understand the conversation. And I don't think that completely understanding the implications of the debt ceiling conversation is going to happen today, although we can like work towards that. What I would love to see, though, and this is kind of something that I was touching on at the very beginning of the call, is that there basically needs to be a thesis presented, as far as I'm concerned, about what the debt ceiling is all about and why that would be good. So somebody needs to boost up the old Google Sheets, Google Docs, and just write up like 10 or 15 sentences or paragraphs, whatever it takes, to create a reasoned and impassioned platform for which people can begin to debate. Because right now, the debt ceiling discussion, from what I can perceive, maybe this is my own perception, but it's spread across 5 or 6 different threads in the MakerGov subreddit. Maybe there's 1 or 2 in MakerDAO. They have various levels of complexity in them. Some of them have really good comments. Some of them have, shitty comments. Somebody needs to aggregate that thinking and come up with a plan that we can all go, okay, this is the debt ceiling plan. What do we think about this? And then we move from there. And then I think that an interesting plan, a possibility, is that maybe we have a governance poll that says, like, hey, are people like, who's interested in talking about this debt ceiling thing seriously? And then if Maker comes out and votes for it, then yeah, then now it's a thing, right? But there needs to be a clear plan of action, as opposed to, hey, we need to change the debt ceiling. It's not going to go anywhere.
Joe, what do you think about the debt ceiling?
I would, I want to give it a little more time, but I think we are breaking down like the overall number of DAI issued. Now we're down to 86 million. Because right now, I thought our mistake was we shouldn't have raised so much and just let it hit the debt ceiling. But I really don't want to lower the debt ceiling. It shows like lower growth. We have like, we're raising up so much. It shows DAI demand at these rates. Think about it as a hedge fund right now. You can go and buy DAI at 97, 98. Sure, you can get a couple $1 million worth from Cumberland, from all these other people, from me. And you could go buy like $5 million of DAI, borrow it, and lend to Dharma or Compound and earn a great return. So it's a matter of another. I don't think it's a debt ceiling as much. I think it's also access to DAI. And this is what the Maker team's working on, like getting more people so people can go buy DAI and then go lend it out. Right now, it takes 2 transactions to really get to DAI. It's not really great. I mean, not many people have access to Coinbase Pro to go from dollar to USDC to DAI. What DAI really needs to be is great access where people can just go and immediately take their credit card and go buy DAI. That hasn't happened yet, but I'm sure the Maker team has tricks up their sleeve.
I don't think we want that, because we're just scaling a problem. Like,
I don't think it's scaling a problem.
Go ahead. You what?
Go ahead, go on. Like,
wouldn't that
Chris and Michael, can you expand on it?
Oh, like if you like, evidently there's a problem in the underlying, like the infrastructure. There's some problem somewhere, and that's what we're trying to find, like identify. And we can't force, and we can evangelize and do that sort of stuff. But demand will come. That's just a fact. We just cannot fight, time and adoption stuff. The only thing we can do between now and when that hits is make sure that there's only one place in town that has the most concrete stable coin that is decentralized. So if we're putting any petrol on the fire right now, some people have said, like, let's list it on Binance and get more awareness and da-da-da. The bigger it gets, the faster people can on-ramp, the faster people can get it and all that kind of stuff, the more problematic it becomes. And we started seeing that pretty significantly. And that's why we had our numbers like really blown out. I think it was like, $1.04 to buy and like 95 cents to sell or something like that. Strictly because we're throttling it because we weren't making any money as a company, as market makers, we weren't making any money. And as DAI shareholders, as KR holders, it was a disservice if But if we sort of knew that it was busting it even more, then we were just like kill switch. So just to keep in mind, something to keep in mind. Yeah, that's all.
Well, there's some good context there, because I think that it's becoming increasingly obvious to a lot of people that the reason that we are having these discussions now is because the community or the voters left this stability fee at an unreasonably low rate for far too long, right? And that's one of the things that needs to be in the back of our mind too. If we do hit that glorious day when we find out where the overshoot is, that responding too aggressively in the opposite direction potentially creates some risks as well, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I mean, on the debt ceiling stuff, the last call that I was like a couple of months ago, I was saying that I'm sort of against the idea of using the debt ceiling as a mechanic. Like, you know, that basically it's a complete admission that the system is not working. That's my reluctancy to use it, but I do agree that I know, sorry, it's factual that the reason this is all blowing out is because the system is not, it's 3.5 or 3.5x the amount of collateral in the system that the system is comfortable with. Based on the price discovery numbers that I'm using, it's saying that it's basically 3.5x bigger than it should be. And so basically, I think this is a really good chance to actually entertain the global settlement. We're going to need to do it. It's going to be, it's going to have to happen at some point anyway. Why not do it when, you know, when there's an actual meaningful reason to do it? And I think it would signal really well to the rest of the market the maturity of execution that Maker is taking to preserve long-term value for shareholders or DAO holders and stuff. I don't know.
But
if
that's
you guys
kind of a Pyrrhic victory at that point, right? Like, it's a Pyrrhic victory at that point. Like, in order to prove that we won, we need to burn everything to the ground, like to show that our resolve is strong.
Well, no,
it's
a mature decision. So, you know, if Rune comes on and says, "Hey, we want this to be a $10 billion market cap for DAI in the next 3 years," so we are going to burn it to the ground. This is a fire drill, guys. Everyone, you're going to hear an alarm. Literally, like Stephen just getting a fire drill out of the call earlier. I think that would signal incredible maturity to the rest of the market. And now's a great time to do it when there's a reason.
Mike, I think
some enormous hesitancy with implementing something like a debt ceiling because we don't completely understand what effects a small lever like that would have. I think that the amount of philosophizing it would take to try and understand what an emergency shutdown would have on the system and consumer confidence and the wider ecosystem and all the people that need to like exchange all their old DAI for new DAI and the hit on the MKR token. That would take
what's going to happen when it's yeah, that's true. But if you have, so we have a motivation to do it right now, and you could say, guys, during these 5 days, we will be executing a global settlement. We're not going to tell anyone other than Rune and Rich and David or whatever. So, and give that predictability just to soften the market a little bit more. I mean, you want to do it when it's 2 billion and you don't get to choose whether or not you're going to do it.
Yeah.
I'll finish up in a second. So there's a corollary in the IT space where if you have like a backup system, but you've never tested that backup system, how do you know you actually have a backup system? And there's kind of that feeling with the global or emergency shutdown. How do we know it's a thing unless it's a lever that we pull? So, and from that respect, we can test the mechanics of it. There's also the how do we signal to the community that we're willing to do this? The signaling part I can kind of understand. It terrifies me, but I can kind of understand. But our willingness to do a global shutdown / emergency, whatever we're calling it these days, emergency shutdown, in the beta stage with potentially whatever 86 billion DAI outstanding does not really signal the fact that we'd be willing to do it with billions of DAI outstanding, right? Like, it's designed to be a fix for a fundamental flaw in either the system, the game theory, the contracts, or the ecosystem as a whole.
There's also another thing to consider here too, because if you have a global settlement before multi-collateral DAI, because there is going to be a global settlement in the transition from single collateral to multi-collateral DAI, you're pretty much cutting short the demand growth of DAI as well, because everybody's going to have to redeem their DAI and their CDPs for collateral. So like the emergency shutdown really should not be used as a flex, because the unintended negative consequences, in my opinion, are very large. And I think what can show the strength of maker governance, probably in relation to like the earlier discussion we had, the idea that the variance in rates for leverage tends to be really high on other reference points, like on Bitfinex, it might be better for maker governance to do higher variance rate changes. That might be a better kind of step before global set down. But again, settlement is exactly
that's
super
a really
blunt
good
instrument.
point. I forgot we are now way closer to the, I mean, look, it's a couple of months away or whatever, but MCD is organically going to trigger that, and it's going to be more predictable. So it probably hits the nail on the head there. I totally dismissed that right now, so I stand corrected. Good point.
There's another thing that I want to talk about as well, and the global settlement / debt ceiling solutions are two examples of probably on the same spectrum. The community is playing with is raising the stability fee in order to find the equilibrium state with which we can manage supply and demand. If we introduce, my concern is that we introduce something like a debt ceiling, or we just shut the thing down and start over again, is we've never learned that lesson. We don't know what the equilibrium state is. We don't know what the correct stability fee is. We don't know how the stability fee impacts people that are laboring, or what the ecosystem is up to, or the price of ether, right? We lose that learning, and that means that once we start the system back up, or we remove the debt ceiling, we have no idea. We're back in the same boat where we need to figure out, okay, what's the appropriate stability fee for this asset class? We'll never know that answer until we find it. Right?
The stability fee is always going to be dynamic. We're never I think the idea of like shooting for this platonic ideal of a stability fee is just not the right way to go for obvious reasons, because there's so much there's the whole system is very dynamic, right? Like a major assumption that we all kind of thought was going to happen was that higher stability fees would push people out of CDPs. But what we never counted on was in ETH bull run, people don't care about paying 16, 20%, 25% per year in interest payments to get permissionless leverage from Maker.
Right. So, but I mean that's good incentives for MKR holders, and they end up generating more for the buy and burn if people are willing to pay. That's one. What I think we discounted was just how valuable permissionless leverage was. If you can get, X% on a centralized exchange, I mean, the benefits and flexibility of permission leverage should probably even be higher.
Facility, to get access to the facility, yes. But if we agree that like DAI as a stablecoin is the chief export of MakerDAO, then I'd say that like we're not doing the best job, right? Like, yes, having the being able to borrow against your ETH and have MKR token holders take on the other side of that bet, that's like, I agree with you, right? Like, who would have thought that would have been so popular, as opposed to kind of like this, like real peer-to-peer cash that's price stable, right? And that's just kind of another reason why I think if you were just managing a balance sheet, right, and you're just looking at kind of, okay, here's what I have outstanding, here's what I'm owed, like, wouldn't you strongly consider trying to say, yep, I'm just not giving out more debt, I'm just not giving out more leverage right now. Like, I don't have like science or algorithms or empirical data backing this. It just seems like a lot of common sense. And so to Mike's point too, hold on one second, I just want to quickly touch on something that Mike said. What Mike said about global settlement, I agree is very extreme, but one of the things that it kind of demonstrates would be the redeemability of DAI to ETH. And I think that that's probably a much larger point than kind of, pushing the, essentially like the bankruptcy button and saying like, yep, like we're bankrupt, but thinking about ways of creating ability.
Hey guys, this is Max. I think that a global settlement is pretty drastic. It's something that it will obviously also show as soon as that's announced is that the DAI peg should, in theory, return to exactly $1. There's no reason why that wouldn't happen because every DAI holder will receive exactly $1 worth of ETH. I mentioned it earlier that that is effectively what should maintain the DAI peg is the risk of global settlement. The problem is, I think now, is that there is no risk of global settlement. There's no time frame for it. And so effectively, the market makers who buy DAI at 98 cents have no idea how long they'll hold that for until they can sell it for $1. Whereas if you're buying DAI to lend, compound, you're going to be making a much higher return on that. And that return will only increase as the stability fee gets pushed out. So I think a solution could be to introduce some kind of scheduled threat of partial settlement, not global settlement, some sort of a partial settlement system.
So Mark, can I just stop you right there? So the partial global settlement system, actually, there's been a lot of talk about it in the Rocket Chat, and there's a lot of kind of complex problems with it, not just from like an implementation standpoint, but also from a game theoretical standpoint. But yeah, just wanted to point that out. If you have like further thoughts, go ahead, because I do also have a couple of thoughts about some other stuff that Chris was talking about.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I'll take a look at that, and maybe that we can continue that conversation next time then, after I read more about that.
All right, cool. So I mean, my thoughts were that I think that the cost of capital and maker governance being willing to really raise the stability fees with higher variance is important because like people can refinance, although it's an obstacle. Lowering supply is step one, right? Like before you see anything in the spot market happening, you're going to see a lowering of supply naturally. But I just think the number one thing to consider really is higher variance in rates. Because number one, as everybody kind of has already said, the emergency shutdown is an extremely disruptive thing that should only be used in case of emergencies or technical upgrades. And yeah, that's all I really wanted to say.
One thing I want to say is, like, if I'm a hedge fund right now, I can go buy DAI at 98, 99 cents and let it on Dharma for almost 14%. I think it's about 11 or 14%. That is an unbelievable return. You don't get that on CDs right now. So if we keep on going higher,
but
you'll see funds come in, and they're going to buy DAI, and they're going to overwhelm the big CDP holder who can take out as much as he wants. But like that demand will take over.
Why don't you guys do that right now then? Like if you have $1 million in DAI, right? If this is so reasonable of like a thing to do, why don't you do it right now? This is
lend out DAI?
Yeah, I'm just saying like there's
helping our partners lend out to DAI to Dharma.
But what I'm saying is like if it's such a good deal, why not just do it then, Joe? Like why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you take that opportunity?
We've got a fair bit.
Well, what do you think I'm thinking about, Chris?
We
I
do
can
it.
Start a fund for $10 million and make a 30%, almost a huge return. Yeah, you want to partner with me, Chris? I'm happy to do that. I'm telling you, that's
you want to yeah. I mean, I'll take it under consideration,
right?
I think a lot of people, Chris, don't do it out of counterparty risk.
Sorry, what's that, Mike? You cut out a bit.
Oh, no. Yeah, sorry. I wasn't interrupting. I was just saying one of the reasons, I mean, I'm not a IRA or RIA or whatever it is. I'm not a licensed fund manager, but I know that one of the things we consider is counterparty risk. If these dudes have whipped up some smart contracts and it's had an audit by, old mate that was a year ago, that's where it's usually really problematic. So people sort of tread carefully, where they might be sitting on $5-10 million worth of DAI, but only deploying like 250K. Plus the markets, they can't actually handle that much. DYDX was 21% if you put it on there. Listen to this. If you 2x short, I think it was a negative 51% negative rate. So it was basically 51% APR. It was bonkers. But it doesn't mean that I could go sink 10 mil onto that market, as with Dharma and stuff like that. Dharma can do up to $2 million at 14%. That is, wow, that's a lot. Yeah. I don't know if we've talked about price discovery, but I think every single thing is going to come back to that period. And I've written a doc. I'm not trying to evangelize my own agenda, because this is actually the complete antithesis of the company's agenda, where we're actually sort of breaking down the market maker. But your price discovery is really important, and price discovery is done by market makers, and market makers get out of bed in the morning from having reasonable incentives. I asked this the other day in the maker chat, and I got airballs, like literally oxygen, when people, I was like, what are the incentives for a market maker? Like, they get the arbitrage, they get the spread. It's like, there is no incentive and there is no arbitrage if you cannot realize the spread. It's like saying there's a 30% discount when I buy ETH here and I sell it in Korea. Great. I've got a whole bunch of KRW now. I can't get that back to US dollars. That's why there's an arbitrage opportunity. So I don't know if you guys know something that I don't, but I feel like I should know more about the incentives of a market maker. Yeah, is there anyone here know what they're really at? Like what the
only thing you have right now is the interest rates. That's it. And you try to make markets around where DAI is trading, but right now there's not been a lot of volume. I think put that earlier.
I think what you need is this. You need two-way flow between borrowers and people paying back their loans. So the stability fee has to be high enough such that you have that two-way flow where DAI fluctuates between 99 and 101, back and forth. That's, if you don't have that, then market makers obviously won't be doing that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jordan, you mentioned that a couple times in the chat about redeemability, and this is a notion that I'm kind of hazy on sometimes. So, Cyrus, can you talk about that a bit? Maybe create some clarity what that means.
About about global settlement?
No, about the redeemability of DAI. Like, this is a conversation that comes up every once in a while, that there needs to be some way for people just to simply convert their DAI into $1. And where is that going to be facilitated, and who picks up the tab, the premium for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know too much about that. I know that, the simple answer why it can't be done is because, right, like whose collateral will you be redeeming as a DAI holder? If you're a DAI holder, then who's redeeming the other side? But I'm not too knowledgeable about like whatever potential solutions are and workarounds and kind of technical answers.
Jordan just typed in the chat, can't hop on the mic. It was Micah's idea to force CDP holders to provide liquidity.
Right. So I think that's the partial global settlement idea, right? Where somehow incentivize some CDP holders to provide liquidity at some pre-specified time intervals. Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I think David does, but I think he may have just jumped off. Sorry.
No problems. I put you on the spot without warning, so it's my fault.
No, it's okay. I just don't know the answer to that.
We're at 10:30. I'm not sure how much momentum we have left. I do know that I need to jump out because I have 13 hours of work I need to do now. Cyrus is in the same boat. So I think that what I want to do is the same thing that I've done for the last two calls. I am going to spend the next hour or two rewatching this call, typing up a summary, getting the videos and audio uploaded. I'll put a recap in the thread that I posted what seems like hours ago. I'll do it again just for clarity's sake. Continue the discussion here in the link I just posted. Questions that weren't asked or answered to people's particular satisfaction, please retype them there if I don't get them to in the summary. And let's continue the chat over the course of the next week. Tomorrow, an executive vote will go up with asking the community if they want to raise the stability fee by 2%. I think that's the end of the call as far as I'm concerned. Cyrus, thanks for your input. Thank you, Michael, Vishesh, the rest of the people that jumped in. It was enormously valuable. Thanks, everybody.
So much, guys.
Bye, everybody.